Police believe that this was some sort of personal dispute. In this shooting, one student is dead, another critically injured. The student who survived this shooting is currently in the hospital, said to be in stable condition. As for the suspect, he is not a student, according to authorities. Authorities arresting Jacob Lee Bard of Evansville, Indiana, charging him with murder and first-degree assault. This all happened Tuesday afternoon on campus near a dorm. All classes have been canceled for the rest of the week as the investigation is still ongoing. But again, police say there is no...
You heard it. You heard that maddening phrase they always use, that soothing institutional incantation that is meant to calm us, to reassure us, to tell us to go back to sleep, because the professionals have it all under control, and there is no continued threat to that community. No continued threat. Those words that just moments earlier had to share airtime with the reality that one young person is dead, and another is fighting for their life in a hospital bed after being shot near a dormitory at Kentucky State University. And we are supposed to accept this cognitive dissonance because we have been trained to accept it, trained to nod along to the normalization of bloodshed on campuses across America, while authorities parse and categorize and minimize the violence into neat little boxes of personal dispute versus mass shooting versus random act, as if the corpse cares about the taxonomy, as if the surviving student in intensive care gives one damn whether Jacob Lee Bard of Evansville had a grudge or just felt like killing that day. Listen to what they are telling you, and listen even more carefully to what they are not telling you, because this was the 73rd shooting on school grounds this year, most of which took place on college campuses, and let that number detonate in your consciousness for a moment, because 73 shootings means 73 moments when someone brought a gun onto educational property and discharged it, 73 times when students who were supposed to be learning and growing and becoming had to instead run or hide or bleed. And the authorities in this Kentucky case want you to know there is no threat, no continued threat, as if threat is something that can be contained and cordoned off like crime scene tape, as if 19-year-old DeJohn Darrell Fox Jr. of Indianapolis, the student who was killed, as if his death is not itself the threat made manifest, the threat we refuse to name because naming it would require us to confront the systems we have built that treat gun violence as an acceptable cost of doing business in America. The framing here is everything. And the framing is poison, because when police say this was some sort of personal dispute, they are performing a kind of rhetorical alchemy, transmuting the public horror of campus gun violence into the supposedly private tragedy of interpersonal conflict. And this matters profoundly, because it allows institutions and lawmakers to evade responsibility, to throw up their hands and declare that you cannot legislate away human emotion. You cannot regulate rage when in fact, what you can and must regulate is access to the instruments of death that turn conflict into carnage in milliseconds. Preliminary information indicates the shooting was caused by a personal dispute and was not a random active shooter situation, they tell us, and Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear emphasized this was not a mass shooting or a random incident. The suspected shooter is already in custody, which means that while this was frightening, there is no ongoing threat, and do you hear it? Do you hear the way they are teaching us to be grateful for our crumbs, grateful that only 2 students were shot instead of 20, grateful that the violence was targeted rather than indiscriminate, as if targeted violence is somehow less obscene, as if a mother's grief is mitigated by knowing her son died for a reason, however senseless rather than at random. And here is where it gets even more sinister, because what this language is doing, what this entire institutional response is engineered to do, is to prevent us from connecting this shooting to the epidemic of gun violence that is unique to America among developed nations, to keep us from recognizing that there have been 209 school shootings so far in 2025, according to the K-12 school shooting database, which should be a number that brings this country to its knees in shame, but instead is merely a statistic to be debated depending on whose definition you use, because apparently we cannot even agree on what constitutes a school shooting anymore. We have had so many that we need multiple competing databases to track them, and scholars to argue about methodology, while children and teenagers and college students die. The normalization is complete when we treat a decrease in school shootings as great news, rather than recognizing that any number above 0 is a catastrophic moral failure. When we have become so accustomed to this distinctively American carnage that we measure our progress by how many fewer students were shot this year, compared to last year, when 65% of students said school shootings made them concerned for their safety on campus, and we treat this as normal, rather than as an indictment of everything we claim to value about education and youth and the future. But wait, because it gets worse. It always gets worse when you pull on these threads, because what has happened in the political sphere while students have been dying is that the Trump administration dismantled the Biden-era White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention and targeted federal programs and research institutions working to prevent gun violence, including removing gun violence as a public health issue from the Department of Health and Human Services website, and the Justice Department repealed the Biden administration's zero-tolerance policy for revoking gun dealers' licenses who violate gun regulations, such as failing to conduct background checks. So at the exact moment when we need government to treat this crisis with the urgency it deserves, we have instead a systematic dismantling of the infrastructure that was just beginning, to address gun violence as the public health emergency that it manifestly is. Meanwhile, the 19th Congress faces a gun lobby-backed majority, where too many lawmakers not only refuse to pass new life-saving gun safety laws, but also work to tear down even the most basic laws already on the books. And this is not happening in a vacuum. This is not accidental. This is the result of decades of ideological capture by an industry that profits from death, and a gun rights movement that has successfully convinced millions of Americans that any regulation whatsoever represents tyranny. And you want to talk about tyranny? Let us talk about the tyranny of living in a country where gun violence kills 125 people in the United States every single day and wounds over 200 more, where gun violence is the current leading cause of death for young people in the U.S., where students at the University of Utah describe how I want to walk to class thinking about my education, not my ability to defend myself if someone were to start shooting, but instead live with the constant low-grade terror that has become the ambient condition of American education. The tyranny is not hypothetical federal overreach. The tyranny is the daily reality of parents sending their children to school, wondering if they will come home alive. The tyranny is DeJohn Darrell Fox Jr., being shot dead at 19 years old outside a residence hall at an HBCU that was the latest HBCU attacked in recent months, after 2 others experienced shootings in October during homecoming weekends, and do not for 1 second think it is coincidental that historically black colleges and universities are being targeted with gun violence when we absolutely know, that there is a slow-rolling crisis of mass shootings that happens in struggling urban communities, poor communities, black and brown communities every single day, that receives a fraction of the attention and policy response that mass shootings in whiter, wealthier spaces receive. The political economy of gun violence in America is a story of calculated inequality, where the Second Amendment has been weaponized not to protect liberty, but to protect profits, where the firearms industry and its lobbyists have spent decades constructing an interpretation of constitutional rights that would have been unrecognizable to most Americans for most of our history, because the overwhelming consensus was that the Second Amendment gave state militias a right to obtain and bear arms, but it did not give individuals any rights, and it really started to change with the rise of the modern conservative movement in the 1970s with Ronald Reagan, Edwin Meese, Orrin Hatch, and the NRA, making a very sustained argument that the courts had misunderstood the Second Amendment for hundreds of years, and it became the conservative conventional wisdom that the Second Amendment gave an individual the right to bear arms. This was not an originalist recovery of lost constitutional meaning. This was a political project, a successful decades-long campaign to manufacture a new reality through repetition and legal activism, and the steady march through institutions until the desired doctrine fell like a ripe apple from a tree in District of Columbia v. Heller, and now we live with the consequences. Now we count the bodies. Because make no mistake, the consequences are being counted in bodies, in trauma, in shattered communities, and when officials say there is no continued threat after a shooting at Kentucky State University, they are lying. They are lying through their teeth, or they are so captured by the logic of the system they serve that they cannot see the lie, because the threat continues every single day that we allow this to go on. The threat continues every single day that we allow this to go on. When the School Violence Prevention Act was introduced in June 2025, with little movement since, the threat continued when a school safety bill had a 6% chance of getting past committee and a 2% chance of being enacted, because that is how our legislative process treats the lives of students, as a 2% priority. The threat continues when school leaders say the amount proposed for school safety funding may not be enough, and a law enforcement shortage nationwide and in Texas makes it more difficult to staff armed officers at all schools, not because armed officers are the solution, they demonstrably are not, but because it reveals that even within the limited imagination of the current political consensus, we cannot muster the resources or political will to do what we claim we want to do. Let me tell you what is actually happening here, because the news clip you just watched is a microcosm of how power operates in America when it comes to gun violence, how the language of law enforcement and institutional authority is deployed to contain and minimize and redirect our rage away from systemic analysis and toward acceptance of the unacceptable. When authorities emphasize that the suspect was not a student, when they stress that this was a personal dispute, when they promise there is no continued threat, they are engaging in a form of narrative control that prevents us from asking the questions that actually matter. Questions like, why was a 48-year-old man able to bring a handgun onto a university campus and shoot 2 students after being involved in a physical altercation? What kind of society do we live in where conflict resolution involves firearms as a matter of course? How many more Dijon foxes have to die before we stop treating gun violence as a series of isolated incidents rather than as the predictable outcome of policy choices that prioritize gun access over human life? The student who survived, the one in intensive care, becomes in this framework merely a supporting character in a story about successful law enforcement response, classes canceled for the rest of the week, as if that is adequate, as if grief and trauma operate on an academic calendar, as if students will return Monday ready to learn when the bloodstains have barely been cleaned from the ground outside their dormitory. University President Kofi C. Akakob called the shooting a senseless tragedy that has left the community mourning the loss of one of its students. And yes, it is senseless in the way that all preventable deaths are senseless, but it is not inexplicable. It is not beyond our capacity to address unless we choose to make it so, unless we decide that the political cost of confronting the gun lobby is higher than the human cost of letting students die. And they will tell you, the defenders of the status quo will tell you with great confidence and no small amount of condescension, that there is nothing to be done, that criminals will always find ways to get guns, that the Second Amendment constrains us, that gun control does not work, and every single one of these claims is either a lie or a distortion, because states with strong gun laws see less gun violence, and states that have failed to put basic protections into place have a rate of gun deaths 2.5 times higher than the states that are national gun safety leaders. Background checks have stopped over 138,000 gun sales annually to criminals, domestic abusers, individuals with dangerous mental illnesses or other prohibited purchasers on average since 1994, which means we know, we have empirical evidence, we have proof that policy matters, and that regulation works, and that the carnage is not inevitable. But here is what you need to understand about the politics of gun violence in America in this moment. In December 2025, as we approach another year of counting bodies and offering thoughts and prayers and changing nothing, the system is working exactly as it is designed to work, and it is designed to prevent meaningful change while giving the appearance of concern. A national bill was introduced to establish an Office of Gun Violence Prevention within the Department of Justice early in the year, and since then there has been little movement on it, but advocacy groups like the Newtown Action Alliance have been pushing for it all year, which tells you everything you need to know about whose voices matter in Congress, and whose do not. The families of victims matter for photo opportunities. Students matter for rhetorical purposes. But when it comes to actual legislative action, the gun industry and its surrogates hold veto power over American democracy, and they exercise that power ruthlessly and effectively because prominent gun rights organizations consistently spent millions more on lobbying in Washington than their gun control counterparts, and have for years. There is a reason why the discourse around guns in America has been so successfully captured by the framework of individual rights abstracted from social consequences, why we talk about the Second Amendment as if it exists in a vacuum, rather than in relationship to all the other rights we claim to value, like the right to life and liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, like the right to learn without fear, like the right to assemble peacefully without armed intimidation. The conservative movement understood decades ago that if you want to change policy, you have to change the terms of debate, you have to make your position seem natural and inevitable, and constitutionally mandated, and so they did. They invested in legal scholars and think tanks and test cases, and a long march through the judiciary until the idea that the Second Amendment gives individuals a right to bear arms was advocated so forcefully and so persuasively that Democrats gave up on fighting the issue, and Obama personally illustrates how much the individual rights view has evolved into the conventional wisdom, even for Democrats. But convention is not inevitability, conventional wisdom is not actual wisdom, and the Second Amendment as currently interpreted by the Supreme Court is not a natural law handed down from on high but rather political as much as legal, about justices who come out of the conservative movement, advocating positions they have advocated for a long time, and what the Second Amendment means is not determined by the Second Amendment, but by who wins presidential elections and gets to appoint their like-minded justices, and these decisions about what the Constitution means are deeply political, and always have been, and always will be. which means that this is not beyond our power to change, which means that when officials tell us there is no continued threat after a campus shooting, they are either ignorant or complicit, because the threat is structural, and it is ongoing and it is killing us. The students at Kentucky State University, the ones who watched their classmate die and their friend get loaded into an ambulance, they understand the threat in a way that politicians insulated by armed security and Supreme Court justices protected by federal marshals never will. 65% of students said school shootings made them concerned for their safety on campus, and a majority said stricter gun laws would make them feel safer, which should be dispositive in a democracy that claims to care about the voices of young people, but instead their fear is treated as a character flaw, as weakness, as failure to understand that an armed society is a polite society, even as the evidence accumulates daily that an armed society is a traumatized society, where conflict becomes fatal, and where students cannot walk to class without calculating escape routes and lockdown procedures. This is what it means to live in a country where there is no continued threat, where threat has become so normalized that it is no longer recognized as threat, but simply as the weather, as the background radiation of American life, and the fact that we can watch a news report about a student shot dead at a university and have it framed primarily through the lens of whether there is ongoing danger to the community rather than through the lens of how did we allow this to happen and what are we going to do to make sure it never happens again, that tells you everything about how thoroughly we have been conditioned to accept the unacceptable. The language of threat assessment, the bureaucratic parsing of mass shooting versus personal dispute versus random, all of this is in service of a political project that requires us to believe that gun violence is either inevitable or too complicated to address or beyond the reach of government intervention, when in fact, the rate at which violent crimes are committed with guns has declined substantially over the past 30 years, with the homicide rate dropping by 50% since 1980, which demonstrates that change is possible when we decide to make it possible. But we have not decided, or rather the people who make decisions in this country have decided, that the status quo serves their interests well enough, and so the shootings continue, and the press conferences follow, and the officials assure us there is no continued threat, while planning the next one, because there will be a next one. There is always a next one. Jacob Liebert will be prosecuted, and likely convicted, and sent to prison, and justice, in the narrowest sense, will be served, while injustice in the broader sense continues unchallenged, and Dazon Darrell Fox Jr. will become another name on a list that grows longer every year, another statistic in a database that scholars will argue about, another victim whose death changes nothing, because we have collectively decided that changing things would require us to challenge power in ways that feel too difficult or too divisive or too threatening to the social order. And so I ask you, as we watch this clip of Kentucky State University and hear about personal disputes and no continued threat, as we move through a year where there have been 17 mass killings this year, according to a database maintained by Northeastern University, the lowest since the database was established in 2006, representing a significant drop from recent years, including 2023, which saw more than 36 such incidents. And we are supposed to celebrate this as progress. What will it take? What will finally be enough? How many more students have to die before we stop lying to ourselves about there being no continued threat, and start addressing the threat that permeates every aspect of American life, wherever guns are present and accessible, and treated as sacred objects beyond the reach of democratic governance? The answer cannot be more armed guards and metal detectors and active shooter drills that traumatize children into accepting that violence is inescapable. The answer has to be a fundamental reimagining of how we think about guns and rights and safety and community, and that reimagining has to begin with telling the truth about what is happening, with refusing to accept the framing that authorities offer us when they say there is no continued threat, with recognizing that every single day that we fail to act is another day when the threat continues, when students go to class in fear, when parents kiss their children goodbye not knowing if it is the last time, when young people like Dazon Fox are shot dead for no reason that will ever make sense. There is a continued threat to that community. There is a continued threat to every community in America, and the threat is not primarily from individual shooters, however dangerous they may be. The threat is from a political and economic system that has decided that gun industry profits and conservative ideology are more important than human lives, that has erected constitutional and rhetorical barriers to change that are presented as immovable, when they are in fact the product of political choices that can be unmade by different political choices. When they tell you there is no continued threat, they are asking you to look away, to move on, to accept that this is just how things are, and we have to refuse, we have to keep looking, we have to keep connecting the dots between this shooting and the next one, and the one after that, and the policy choices that make them all possible. We have to stay angry and focused and organized, because that is the only way anything ever changes in this country. That is the only way we honor the memory of students like Dejon Fox and turn their deaths into something other than meaningless tragedies that we ritualize and then forget. The threat continues, the work continues, and the question is whether we finally have the courage to do what we know needs to be done,